going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to physically build a gaming PC. This is part 2. Part 1 will be linked down in the description if you missed it. We went over how to pick your PC parts, and part 3 will be releasing over the next few days. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that video. And of course, smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. With that said, let's get into it. So to just quickly touch on what we're going to be using in today's build, for the CPU we're going to be going with the Ryzen 7 3700X. This is a great processor with 8 cores and 16 threads, with a boost clock up to 4.4 gigahertz. As for what motherboard platform we're going with the X570 motherboard. And honestly, the B550 for ITX are actually very comparable, but I decided to go with the X570 to give me a little bit more overclocking potential in the future. As far as RAM goes, we went with a 32 gigabyte kit at 3600 megahertz speed with the CL16 memory. And 32 gigabytes is probably a little bit overkill, but I just wanted to future-proof myself for the future and to make sure my system was nice and crispy. And we'll be utilizing PCI Gen 4 with this NVMe Gen 4 SSD storage from Gigabyte. This is a 1 terabyte version, but they have 500 and up to, I think, around 4 terabytes of storage. These are going to be really fast, and they'll be really nice for the next generation games when game developers will start to optimize for faster storage solutions. And for our graphics card, we're going to be using the AMD 5700 XT. This is going to be a great CPU to pair with our 3700X, and you should get comparable performance to about RTX 2070 Super. And the star of our show is our case. We're going to be building in the NZXT H1. This is a little bit of an untraditional ITX motherboard case, but it looks really good. Now that we've gone over all the parts, let's get to the build. So to begin, you're going to want to find a nice flat surface where you have a lot of room to work with. You're also not going to be wanting to work on carpet or be wearing socks. And I know that sounds weird, but you should be working on a concrete or hardwood floor. This will prevent static discharge onto one of your components while you're building it, which actually might cause it to break. Now, all you're going to need to build a gaming computer is basically just a Phillips head screwdriver. You might want a few sizes and different lengths, but this is the only tool you're going to need. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get out your motherboard box and maybe your CPU, your RAM, and if you have an NVMe storage drive, you're going to want that to get that out as well. You just want a nice clean surface. So first we need to just unbox the motherboard. Now the experience is going to be about the same, but normally your motherboard is going to come with an anti-static bag. Now definitely keep this anti-static bag. It's going to make your motherboard more valuable when you come to sell it. And also I recommend, just as a side note, to keep all your PC part boxes. Once we get it out, we're actually just going to need the motherboard for now, and then we can close the box, and we're going to use the motherboard box as a building surface. Then we can slide it up and set it right on top of the motherboard, but make sure to keep this anti-static bag. Next up, you're going to be wanting to get your CPU. So normally they're going to be housed in this little side compartment, and here's also your heatsink, but today we're going to be going with an AIO water cooler, so we're not going to need that. All we're going to need is this guy right here. So once we get it out, and you can carefully open the package so the CPU doesn't go flying. So now we're going to socket the CPU into the motherboard. Now what you're going to want to do is find a triangle on your socket, and you can see here it's in the top left corner. Now carefully picking up your CPU, you're going to want to find the golden triangle on the CPU, and for mine it's right in that corner. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to lift up the retention bracket and put it down, and you should be able to just set it down in place, lining up the triangles. It should require no force, and you just set it down like that, and once it's set in there, you can just lower the retention bracket and put it under the little lever. And there we go, your CPU is now installed. Next up, we're going to be needing our RAM. Normally the unboxing experience is actually pretty easy. With here, you're just going to need to pop them open, pop the packaging open, and get the 2 DIMM slots out. For the RAM, again, we're going to be using the Trident Z Neo 32 gigabyte 2x16 gig kit at 3600 megahertz speed and CL16 latency. So to install the RAM, you're going to want to unlatch the RAM little latches on both sides of the RAM slots. And you just take the RAM, and now the notch is going to be closer to one side than the other. And so you just line it up with the slot, and you press down with a little bit of force. And it is going to feel a little bit weird, but trust me, you're going to need to apply a little bit of force. And there we go. Your RAM is now installed. Now we're going to be moving on to the PCIe NVMe. Now on ITX motherboards, there's normally going to be a little bit of a shield that's covering the NVMe slot. So what you're going to want to do is unscrew the slot and it's just going to kind of come off. Now mine actually is plugged in because it includes a fan. So you're just going to want to kind of flop it off to the side because you don't want to be breaking this wire. Now off to the side of your NVMe drive, there's going to be a little screw, and that's actually what's going to hold down one of the sides of your NVMe drive. So what you're going to want to do is you're just going to take the NVMe drive and slot it into place. And after it's slotted in, you're going to want to press it down just a little bit to where you can screw the screw back on top. So with that, this actually doesn't have any thermal heat pads, but instead it actually has a fan. So we're just going to put that back over top. So now you're going to want to screw all those screws back into place. And once you're done, your PCIe NVMe drive is installed. And this is actually as far as we can go without the case. And for the case, we're going to be going with the NZXT H1, which is a little bit of a unique case with an unusual form factor. And it also already has an AIO installed in it and a power supply. So to get inside the NZXT H1, what you're going to want to do is you just pop the front panel off like this. You're also just going to pop this back panel off, and it just pops off like that. And with the front and side panels off, you can actually just slide this little side and top panel off. We have a little bit of a GPU box, and it looks like there's some accessories in here. So in the box, we get a power cable for the power supply, some mounting hardware for the AIO, a few cables and zip ties, along with some instructions. And also on this side, we're gonna have a lot of the front USB. But to get inside the NZXT H1, we're gonna need to unscrew these two screws up here. And with those screws unscrewed, we can actually just pop out this AIO. It comes with a nice styrofoam protector, and we kind of just wiggle this out, the AIO block can come out. And what's really nice about this case is a lot of these cables are actually pre-routed for us, so we don't have to do a lot of cable management. And as you can see here, there's just a little side panel covering our power supply unit. And this case also comes with a PCIe riser cable. Since we have all the case unboxed, we can actually go ahead and mount the motherboard inside of it. And included with your case, there's actually going to be some screws to mount the motherboard to the case, and you're going to find out what screws those are in your directions. So once you find out what screws you need, in my case there's screw A's, you're going to need to go into your little accessory bags and find those screws. Very easily, I found the screws inside my accessory bags, and these are the 4 screws that we're going to need to mount the ITX motherboard to the case. So now we can go ahead and mount the motherboard to our case. So what do you want to do? You're just going to want to slowly slide in the motherboard, trying not to crack or scratch or break anything. You're going to want to find where your IO shield lines up with your case, and you're just going to want to put it right there, and it actually will just sit in there, especially in the NZXT H1 if you have your case set it down horizontally. So now you're going to want to get your screws out to mount your motherboard and then screw them in. And a little bit of a tip here, just across PC building, you're always going to want to screw in a diagonal pattern, applying even force across the board. And so now, with the motherboard mounted, we're going to want to either deal with your heatsink or your AIO in this case. So with the NZXT H1, there's actually a special AMD mounting bracket. And so we can pop the Intel bracket off, and we can go ahead and install the AMD bracket onto the AIO, like so. So with the AMD bracket, you actually had to install these 2 little pieces to the side. So now that that's ready, we put it right back on to the water block. So now with that bracket installed, we're going to install it onto the CPU. You're just going to want to screw down the heatsink on both sides evenly until you feel like it's applying adequate pressure. So once that's done, we can actually take a time to plug all these cables in. As you can see, there's a lot of little connectors all over the motherboard, and there's also a lot of cables to plug in. So what I would suggest you to do is find your motherboard pamphlet that's included inside your motherboard box and find the diagram of where all these plugs plug in. There's always going to be a CPU 8 power connector that's going to be needed to plug into the CPU to power your CPU. There's also going to be a 24-pin connector that's always going to need to be powered in the CPU. And if you have front I/O, things like USB 3.0, a power switch, power lights, and in this case, we actually have a USB-C header, but sadly, this motherboard does not support USB-C. So these cables only have one way to plug in. Like you can see, the USB header has this little notch, and you're just gonna wanna line it up with the notch on the plug. As you can see here, there's a little bit of notch right where my fingernail is, and that's how you're gonna plug it in. So after consulting the manual a few times, I got all the internal connectors plugged in, and I just have a little bit of cable management, which I'll deal with towards the end. And since the NZXT H1 comes with a riser cable, we'll just take the time to go ahead and plug that in, and it comes with a nice little cover. And all you have to do is make sure your PCIe slot is open. You just plug it in like that, and it'll snap, and there you go, it's in. And after that, basically, we have everything installed besides the graphics card. So I'm gonna actually just go ahead and package this up, and then we're gonna move on to the graphics card. So now, with everything basically wrapped up inside the case besides the GPU, we're gonna take our time to install that now. And you'll find that your GPU always comes into an anti-static bag as well. And of course, keep this. And as I said earlier, we're going to be using the 5700 XT, and this is going to be the MSI Mech OC. Now to install a GPU, this is going to be a vertical GPU, but it's going to be the same as a horizontal. But you're going to need to unscrew these screws, because that's actually what's going to screw into these two holes to help hold the GPU in place. So to install the GPU, you're just going to want to slide it in. You're gonna want to line up your PCIe little connector. Once you line that up and you got your slots all lined up, you just press down until you hear a click, and then you can go back over where you just took those two thumb screws out, and you can install them back onto the GPU. Plug in your GPU power connectors. Here we have an 8 and a 6 pin, and we just find these corresponding cables with our power supply. And since we're done wiring up, we can just put this little cover back on. So with everything installed, we're just gonna close it up. Ooh. So now that everything is built inside the case, let's go over to my setup and see if it turns on. So now we're all done with the build, and now is the moment of truth, if the computer boots. So we're gonna go ahead and press the power button, and it looks, at least it's turning on inside, but now we're just gonna have to wait for the boot. And this normally, after turning on a new computer, will take about anywhere from 30 to 40 seconds. And it booted. So that's gonna be it for today's video. This is just part 2 where we showed you how to build the computer, but part 3 will be releasing over the next few days, where I'll be teaching you guys how to install Windows 10 on a newly built computer. So be sure to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss that video. I'll see you guys in part 3.